This is Bone Chillers to disturb your dreams. Dare to join us? Click subscribe, ring the bell. But remember, we cannot guarantee your safety from the nightmares that await. Prepare to be thrilled, chilled, and filled with a sense of dread you'll find nowhere else. Welcome to the darkness. We've been waiting.
The Rift Devours. The rescue ship Erebus glided toward the derelict vessel, a jagged silhouette against the distant shifting hues of the accretion disk surrounding a dying star. The vessel was the Vanguard, a colony ship lost 2 decades earlier in the vastness of interstellar space, reappearing only days ago in a position light years from its original trajectory. Captain Mara Voss stood at the bridge, her fingers gripping the railing as the flickering light from the dying star illuminated the skeletal structure of the Vanguard. It was too pristine for a ship adrift for 20 years. No wear, no scorch marks. The hull gleamed like polished obsidian. "Still no signs of life," said Lieutenant Aidan Ross, his voice taut with unease. The ship's scanning systems hummed as they probed the Vanguard, returning only silence. "That's impossible," Mara said, her tone flat. "The Vanguard had over 3,000 colonists aboard. Even with cryofailure, there'd be remains." "Captain," said Dr. Elena Graves, the ship's science officer, her face pale as she studied the readings. "The Vanguard isn't emitting any power signatures, but—" She hesitated. "It's pulling energy from somewhere. The readings are—" She stopped, biting her lip. "Unnatural." Mara's eyes didn't leave the screen. "Prepare the boarding team." The airlock seals hissed and the boarding crew stepped into the Vanguard. The corridor stretched ahead like a metallic throat, dimly lit by intermittent flashes of crimson emergency lighting. The walls glistened, not with moisture, but something darker, viscous, as though the ship itself had begun to bleed. "Keep comms open," Mara commanded. She led the team with calculated precision, her pulse steady despite the oppressive silence pressing against them. The first body appeared 50 meters in, a crewman, frozen mid-scream. His face was a rictus of terror, his eyes dark sockets, empty and endless. Ross bent down to examine the corpse, then recoiled. "It's like it's been hollowed out," he said, his voice trembling. "No organs, no bones." "Then what's holding it together?" Graves asked, her whisper lost in the quiet hum of the ship. No one answered. The bridge was an orgy of chaos. The command chairs were overturned, and bloodless corpses sat slumped in unnatural positions. Data terminals flickered erratically, displaying indecipherable symbols that seemed to twist and writhe when stared at too long. Graves approached a console, brushing a strand of blonde hair from her face, as her trembling fingers activated a playback log. A cacophony of screams filled the room, distorted and otherworldly, like voices dragged across shards of glass. "Tried to escape," one voice rasped. "Not space. Something else." Static. "Engine is a door. Open to. It's alive." The playback ended with a guttural roar that made Mara instinctively reach for her sidearm. The air felt heavier now, electric with unseen malice. "This ship didn't just vanish," Graves murmured. "It went somewhere." "Captain," Ross called, standing by a panel smeared with dark fluid. "Found the engine logs. Last recorded coordinates are impossible. It's logged as somewhere outside known space." Mara's jaw tightened. "Graves, figure out how this ship got back. Ross, find any survivors." "And if we do?" Ross asked, his tone shaded with dread. "Then we bring them home," Mara said, though her words rang hollow in the thickening air. Deeper into the Vanguard, the hallways grew stranger, the architecture shifting subtly, as though the ship were twisting itself into a labyrinth. Walls buckled outward, pulsating faintly, as though they were breathing. The team's flashlights caught glimpses of shapes, figures darting at the edges of their vision, gone before they could focus. "This place isn't just derelict," Graves said, her voice cracking. "It's infected." "Infected with what?" Mara demanded, her patience waning. Graves hesitated, her eyes wide. Not a what, a where. They reached the core engine room where the Vanguard's experimental drive had once been housed. Instead of the sleek machinery they expected, the chamber was a yawning void of blackened metal and twisting fractal-like tendrils. In the center, suspended like a grotesque jewel, was a glowing, translucent orb. It pulsed faintly, emitting a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate within their very bones. Graves stepped forward, drawn despite the nausea curling in her gut. This isn't technology, she whispered. This is alive. Alive? Ross asked, stepping back. Like some kind of alien tech? Graves shook her head. No, this is something else. I think it's a bridge, a link to wherever the Vanguard went. Before anyone could respond, the orb flared. The chamber was bathed in sickly, otherworldly light. And then the screaming began. Ross was the first to collapse, his screams choking into silence as black tendrils erupted from his eyes and mouth, pulling his body into the pulsating orb. Graves shrieked as she stumbled backward, her flashlight catching a glimpse of something emerging from the walls. Elongated figures, their features warped, their movements unnatural. "Retreat!" Mara shouted, firing her weapon at the approaching forms. The bullets struck, but the creatures didn't falter. They moved with predatory grace, their hollow eyes fixed on the intruders. Graves was dragged into the darkness by unseen hands, her screams echoing in the chamber as Mara ran, her breath ragged, her mind racing. Mara reached the Erebus's airlock, slamming her hand on the emergency override. The door hissed open, and she collapsed inside, gasping for air. She was alone. The crew of the Erebus found her hours later, curled into a corner, clutching a shard of twisted metal. Her eyes were glassy, her skin pale. She muttered incoherently, fragments of words that made no sense. We're not stars, we're not space, and it's all eyes, we're watching. She was sedated and placed in quarantine, though her words lingered, unsettling the crew. The Erebus departed, leaving the Vanguard adrift once more. Days later, its crew began to notice changes, the ship's lights dimming without cause, the air growing colder. And then the whispers began, faint at first, then growing louder, filling every corridor with voices not their own. The Erebus changed course, but its engines faltered. Communications were lost. When it was found months later, its crew was gone, the ship's walls slick with a dark, viscous substance. In the engine room, investigators found a glowing, pulsating orb. The last log entry, recorded in Captain Mara Voss's voice, simply said, "The Rift Devours."
The undulating hunger. The first sign of change was a subtle ripple beneath the skin, as though something ancient and impatient stirred within the muscles. Jodie first noticed it in her neighbour Hal, during one of their rare but polite encounters in the hallway. Hal had always been a reclusive figure in the crumbling apartment complex, his thick glasses and perpetually hunched posture lending him the air of a man trying to disappear from the world. That morning, he seemed less like himself, his skin unnaturally taut and glistening under the flickering fluorescent lights. Jodie hesitated before asking, "You okay, Hal?" He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he tilted his head in a way that reminded her of a mantis examining prey, his lips parting slightly as if to taste the air. Then, with a voice like dry leaves scratching against concrete, he muttered, "Feels like I'm waking up." By the time she returned to her apartment, Jodie couldn't shake the creeping unease that followed her. The hallway had felt too warm, the air thick with the scent of iron. She tried to distract herself with chores, turning up the volume of her ancient radio, but the static between songs seemed unusually loud, almost deliberate, as though the device was straining to carry some hidden message. That night, the dreams began. She found herself standing in an alien landscape, a vast expanse of writhing tendrils stretching as far as the eye could see. The air hummed with a low, guttural sound that seemed to resonate from inside her chest. In the distance, a colossal figure loomed, its shape constantly shifting, like a great maw perpetually forming and reforming. A voice, a deep, resonant whisper that vibrated in her bones, spoke a single word. Hungry. Jodie awoke, drenched in sweat, her body trembling as if she'd been running for miles. Her hands unconsciously went to her arms, fingers tracing over her skin, searching for something. What? She didn't know. The next morning, the apartment building buzzed with whispers about Hal. A maintenance worker found him in his unit, the place reeking of copper and rot. The coroner was called, but the body was so grotesquely transformed that rumours spread before the professionals could establish any facts. His skin, they said, had split in places, revealing intricate spiralling patterns of bone and sinew beneath. His eyes were gone, replaced by small pulsating orbs of dark tissue that quivered in the harsh light. Looked like something was trying to crawl out of him, one of the tenants muttered to Jodie when she passed. Jodie wanted to dismiss it as hyperbole, but she couldn't shake the growing nausea that gnawed at her. That evening, she locked her door, ignoring the faint knocking that came later, 3 slow, deliberate taps that seemed to echo in her skull long after they stopped. By the 3rd day, the transformation began to spread. Jodie saw it in the supermarket, in the shuffling figures of strangers. A woman near the produce section scratched at her neck, revealing red, raw skin beneath. An elderly man in the bakery aisle muttered to himself, his jaw moving in unnatural jerks, his teeth falling out one by one onto the floor as if his body no longer needed them. Back at home, the sensation started beneath Jodie's ribs. A faint twitch, almost imperceptible. She tried to ignore it, attributing it to nerves, but as she stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, she caught a flicker of movement under her skin. Something coiled just below the surface, something alive. She pressed her hands against her stomach, panic surging. The thing responded with a faint undulation, a ripple that sent her reeling backward. Her reflection in the mirror shimmered, her face fracturing into pieces before snapping back into focus. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and the sound of the word from her dream, hungry, echoed in her mind. The following day, the city was descending into chaos. The news stations struggled to provide answers, their anchors visibly unnerved as they read reports of mass hysteria and bizarre physical mutations. Authorities suggested a viral outbreak, though no one could explain the strange growths or the reports of people disappearing altogether, leaving behind only faint impressions in the ground, as though they'd been pressed into it. Jodie stayed indoors, though she wasn't sure it mattered anymore. Her body felt alien, her movements sluggish and imprecise, as if she were a marionette held by clumsy strings. The twitching beneath her skin had grown more pronounced, spreading to her arms and legs. Her veins darkened, pulsing with an ichor that glowed faintly in the dim light of her apartment. The radio blared static again, the crackling sound louder than before. But this time, it resolved into words spoken in a guttural, inhuman tone. The feast begins. By nightfall, the city outside Jodie's window was unrecognizable. The streets were overrun with figures that no longer resembled people. Their bodies had warped grotesquely, limbs lengthened and bent at unnatural angles, skin peeled back to reveal strange, spiraling patterns of exposed bone. They moved in jerky, spasmodic bursts, as if something inside them was struggling to break free. And above it all, the sky churned, clouds folding in on themselves to reveal a gaping void. From the void came tendrils of black and crimson light, stretching downward to touch the earth. Where they landed, the transformed figures gathered, kneeling in supplication, their bodies trembling with reverence. Jodie's own transformation was nearing its climax. Her vision blurred, her teeth crumbled into dust, and her fingers lengthened unnaturally, their tips sharpening into claws. She tried to scream, but could only emit a low, guttural moan that didn't feel like her own voice. Her reflection in the mirror had become a grotesque caricature of her former self, her eyes replaced with dark orbs that pulsed in rhythm with her accelerating heartbeat. She knew she couldn't stay. Compelled by a force she couldn't name, Jodie stumbled outside. The air smelled of burning metal and rotting flesh. Around her, the transformed figures swayed as if to some unseen rhythm, their heads tilted toward the void above. She joined them, her body moving involuntarily, drawn to the massive figure now emerging from the sky. It was the thing from her dream, larger than she'd imagined. Its form defied logic, a mass of writhing tendrils and mouths that continuously opened and closed, each revealing another layer of teeth and tongues. Its presence was overwhelming, its sheer size and malevolence pressing down on her like a physical weight. As she knelt, the words resonated through her once more. Hungry. And then she understood. The transformations, the chaos, the spreading madness, it was all part of the creature's feeding. It wasn't consuming flesh or blood, but identity itself, reshaping its victims into extensions of its own grotesque form. She could feel her thoughts slipping away, her memories unraveling, replaced by an insatiable hunger that wasn't hers. The last vestige of Jodie's humanity screamed in protest, but it was drowned out by the undulating roar of the ancient being. Her body convulsed violently, and then she was no longer Jodie, but something more. Something vast and infinite, an extension of the hunger itself.
The creature had come to devour, and it was far from finished.
The arrival of the harbingers. The rain began before dawn, falling in heavy silver sheets that obscured the moon and stars. It wasn't an ordinary rain. It carried a metallic sheen and smelled faintly of ammonia and ozone. By the time Molly stepped out onto her porch in the sleepy coastal town of Pinehaven, the world had already begun to change. She stood in her worn slippers and flannel robe, gazing at the distorted landscape. The rain, glowing faintly, pooled in iridescent puddles on the cracked pavement, reflecting impossible geometries. The oak tree in her yard seemed taller, its branches twisting unnaturally, as if reaching for the heavens. The familiar sound of the surf, always a comforting backdrop, now carried an unsettling rhythm, like a heartbeat too slow and too loud. Molly tightened her robe and stared down the road leading into town. Nothing moved. No cars. No neighbors. Just the unrelenting downpour and the eerie stillness of the world adjusting to some incomprehensible new order. It began the night before, with reports of strange lights in the sky over major cities. News anchors scrambled to explain, but there was no consistency. Some described the lights as pulsating, others as flowing, and a few dared to say they looked alive. Then the signals faded. Television, radio, even the internet, all blank, leaving the world in silence and uncertainty. By morning, the rain had arrived. Molly retreated inside and locked the door. Not that it made her feel any safer. Her husband, James, had been on a fishing trip miles off the coast when the phenomena began. She tried calling him a dozen times before the lines went dead. Now she sat at the kitchen table, a battery-powered lantern casting shadows on the walls. Her dog, Max, a loyal German shepherd, whimpered at her feet. "It's just the rain," she whispered, more to herself than to Max. "It'll stop soon." But it didn't. As the hours dragged on, the rain intensified, and with it came new horrors. The first sign was the tapping at the windows, not the rain, but something deliberate, rhythmic, and wrong. Molly froze as Max growled low in his throat, staring at the darkened panes. Tap, tap, tap. The sound moved from one window to the next, circling the house. Heart pounding, Molly grabbed the heavy flashlight James kept by the door. She flicked it on and crept toward the living room, Max at her side. When she aimed the beam at the window, she saw nothing but streaks of rain. Yet the tapping continued, more insistent now, accompanied by a soft, wet whisper that she couldn't understand but made her stomach churn. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. Then the whispers stopped. The silence was worse. Molly spent the next hour pacing the house, flashlight in hand. Max stayed close, his ears twitching at every sound. She tried to rationalize the tapping, blaming it on loose branches or the storm, but deep down, she knew it wasn't true. The rain changed again. Molly noticed it first when the sound of the downpour grew hollow. She stepped to the front door and pressed her ear against it. What she heard chilled her to the core. Voices. Faint but distinct, layered and overlapping, as if a crowd were murmuring just outside. Their words were unintelligible, spoken in a language that seemed older than time, a guttural symphony that made her feel small and exposed. Max began barking, a sharp, frantic sound that Molly had never heard from him before. "Shh, Max," she whispered, though her hands trembled as she reached for his collar. The barking stopped abruptly. Molly looked down and saw Max staring at the door, his eyes wide and unblinking. His tail was tucked low, and his body trembled. "What is it, boy?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Before she could move, the voices outside rose to a crescendo, then fell silent again. A single knock echoed against the door. Molly stepped back, her breath caught in her throat. The flashlight beam trembled as she pointed it at the door. "Go away," she screamed, her voice cracking. The knock came again, and it wasn't a human knock. It was slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud, as if something far too massive stood on her porch, testing the boundaries of her fragile home. Molly did what instinct demanded. She ran. With Max at her heels, she bolted into the kitchen and out the back door, flashlight guiding her through the rain. The metallic drops hissed as they touched her skin, leaving faint burns that she ignored in her panic. She didn't know where she was running, only that she couldn't stay. The streets of Pine Haven were deserted, the houses dark and lifeless. She banged on a few doors, screaming for help, but no one answered. The rain soaked her through, and the whispers returned, louder now, surrounding her. "Molly!" She froze. It was her name. Clear and unmistakable, spoken in the voice of her husband. "James?" she called, spinning in circles, the flashlight darting through the rain. There was no response, only the sound of the rain and the whispering chorus. "Molly," the voice repeated, but this time it was layered, distorted, as if a dozen people were speaking in unison. "Where are you?" she cried, tears mixing with the rain. Ahead, through the downpour, she saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was tall and motionless, its outline shimmering like a heat mirage. Molly hesitated, then took a cautious step forward. "James?" The figure didn't move. She raised the flashlight and shone it on the figure. What she saw made her stagger back in horror. It wasn't human. The thing resembled a man in shape only, its body an amalgamation of silver and black, rippling as if made of liquid metal. Its face was a blank, featureless void, yet she felt its gaze pierce her soul. "Molly," it said again, the voice echoing in her mind rather than her ears. She turned and ran, her scream swallowed by the storm. The phenomena escalated as Molly fled. Trees writhed like serpents, the ground cracked and bled a black, viscous fluid, and the rain grew heavier, pelting her with stinging droplets that seemed to claw at her skin. She reached the edge of town, where the road led into the dense forest. For a moment, she considered turning back, but the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps behind her made the decision for her. Max barked once and then fell silent again. "Come on, boy," she urged, dragging him into the woods. The forest offered no safety. The trees stretched impossibly high, their trunks twisting in ways that defied physics. Pale, glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, watching her from every direction. The whispers became a deafening roar, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. Molly stumbled over roots and rocks, her breath ragged, her body screaming for rest. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. When she finally collapsed in a small clearing, she realized the rain had stopped. The silence was complete, oppressive, and wrong. She looked up and saw the sky. It wasn't the sky she knew. The stars were gone, replaced by swirling vortices of color and light. Massive, otherworldly structures floated above, their forms constantly shifting, their purpose unknowable. Molly understood then that this wasn't just a storm or an invasion. It was the end of everything she knew, and she was utterly alone. Fragments of the grid, the skyline of Neo-Detroit slashed the smog-choked sky like jagged knives, neon ads flickering across the void with promises of wealth, escape, or synthetic pleasure. Beneath the electric sheen, the streets pulsed with the hum of drones, the skitter of autonomous couriers, and the low, ominous thrum of humanity scraping by. Somewhere in the heart of this chaos, Jackson's Cypher Vance nursed his last shot of synth whiskey in a dive that smelled like fried circuits and regret. Cypher was a relic. Once a legend in the grid, Neo-Detroit's sprawling, semi-legal cyber network, he was now an obsolete husk. The grid had evolved faster than his hands could code, leaving him behind. His reflexes dulled, his cred drained. He spent his nights reliving old glory through the static haze of outdated neurofeeds. Tonight, though, was different. Tonight, a stranger had slipped into his booth, sliding a data shard across the sticky table. A stranger who didn't belong in a place like this. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice sharp as glass. Her face was half-shadowed beneath a hood, but the glint of her iridescent retinal implants betrayed her as corpo-grade, not local, dangerous. Cypher stared at the shard. It gleamed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. "If you're here to pitch me a pyramid scheme," he muttered, "save your breath." "This isn't a sales pitch." The stranger leaned in. "It's a resurrection." Her words hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Cypher's gaze flicked from the shard to her face. Beneath the synthetic sheen, there was something feral in her eyes. Hunger, desperation. "What's the job?" he asked, against his better judgment. "High-value target, well protected. We need someone who can crack the grid." "Someone younger," Cypher countered. "Someone better." "No one's better than you at riding the black, not when it's like this." She tapped the shard. "We're talking pre-collapse architecture, legacy systems, analog bleed." Cypher's pulse quickened despite himself. Analog bleed. Rare, ancient code that refused to die, even in a world built on quantum AI. It was messy, unpredictable, alive, and deadly. "I'm out of practice," he said, though the words sounded weak even to him. "That's not an answer," she replied, standing. Her coat rippled with embedded smart thread, an unsettling shimmer of scales. "If you want out, walk away now. But if you take this shard, you're in. No backing out." She didn't wait for a response. The door hissed shut behind her, leaving Cypher alone with the shard. The apartment was a hovel. Layers of cracked paint peeled from the walls, and the air was heavy with the scent of burnt circuits and stale soy. Cypher's ancient rig hummed on a makeshift desk, its casing scarred from years of jury-rigged repairs. He slotted the shard into the port and felt the sudden, electric tingle in his temples as the data unfolded into his neural interface. The blueprint filled his vision, a sprawling corporate vault buried deep within the grid, layered with defenses that made his stomach churn. Ice walls bristled with adaptive algorithms, viral countermeasures, and spikes that would fry a Decker's brain if they got too close, and at the heart of it, a name he hadn't heard in years: Dreamline Systems. Once a titan of biotech and military-grade cybernetics, Dreamline had imploded during the collapse, leaving behind only whispers of its secret projects. Its name now conjured ghost stories in the underground, tales of rogue AIs and bleeding-edge neural implants that drove people mad. And now someone wanted Cypher to break in. The shard's interface buzzed. A vidlink opened, displaying the stranger's face. Her implants shimmered as if alive. "Tomorrow 9 p.m, she said. "Meet at the sledge." The link cut out before he could respond. The sledge was an industrial wasteland, concrete monoliths wrapped in coils of razor wire, their shadows crawling with black market traders, junkies, and hackers for hire. Cypher spotted her immediately, standing beneath a flickering streetlight. She wasn't alone. 2 others flanked her, a wiry Decker with augmented fingers that twitched like spider legs, and a hulking figure whose cybernetic arms gleamed like chrome statues. "No names," she said as Cypher approached. "No faces. You're here because you have skills. Let's keep it clean." Cypher nodded. "You've got muscle, tech, and mystery," he said dryly. "What's missing?" "Access," the stranger replied. And that's where you come in. She handed him a neural rig, a sleek black device pulsing faintly with borrowed life. Cypher slipped it on, feeling the familiar weight settle over his skull. It was state-of-the-art, its connection smooth as glass. "Brief me," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Dreamline buried something in their vault before they burned," she explained. "We need it out." "What's something?" "That's classified." Cypher sighed. "Of course it is." The wiry Decker snickered. "Hope you're still as good as the stories, old man. You screw up, we all die." Cypher ignored him and jacked in. The grid hit like a lightning storm. Streams of raw data surged past him, twisting into abstract shapes and cascading light. Cypher's avatar, an angular figure wreathed in static, descended into the depths of Dreamline's vault. The ice walls shimmered like oil slicks, bristling with defensive code. The team followed, their avatars distinct, the strangers sharp and streamlined, the Decker a chaotic tangle of shifting shapes, and the muscle a towering obsidian monolith. Cypher's fingers danced across his rig, bypassing the first layer of security with practiced precision. Code unfolded like paper under his touch, revealing the labyrinth beyond. "Keep it tight," he muttered. "We've got spikes waiting to gut us." The deeper they went, the more the system seemed alive. It shifted in response to their intrusion, as if aware of their presence. Cypher's nerves prickled. Something about this wasn't right. "Firewall ahead," he said. "Big one." "Can you burn it?" the stranger asked. "Not without waking up the neighbors." "Do it," she ordered. Cypher unleashed a burst of viral code. The firewall crackled and collapsed, but the system roared to life. Alerts screamed through the grid as defensive programs surged toward them, sleek, predatory constructs armed with kill code. "Here we go," the Decker muttered, unleashing countermeasures. A digital dogfight erupted, light and sound tearing through the virtual space. Cypher focused on the path ahead, carving through layers of defenses as his team held off the attackers. "Almost there," he said, sweat slicking his temples. Then he saw it, the vault. It pulsed with raw alien energy. The analog bleed was everywhere, twisting the code into organic shapes that writhed and pulsated. Cypher hesitated. This wasn't just old architecture. This was something else. "Open it," the stranger ordered. Cypher's gut screamed no, but his hands moved anyway, dismantling the final locks. The vault groaned and opened, spilling light that seared his vision. Inside was a fragment, a sliver of pure data, shimmering with impossible colors. Cypher's neural interface buzzed with warnings as the fragment reached out, brushing his mind. Pain, ecstasy, terror, memories that weren't his. "Grab it," the stranger barked. Cypher hesitated. "This thing isn't just data, it's—" "I said grab it!" The fragment pulsed again, stronger this time. It was alive. A whisper crawled through Cypher's mind, promising power, knowledge, freedom. He yanked his rig free. The grid collapsed around him, dumping him back into his body. His heart thundered as the stranger loomed over him, her eyes cold. "You had one job," she said. "This thing isn't safe," Cypher snapped. "It's—" Her gun was out before he could finish. "Move!" Cypher's eyes darted to the others. The muscle cracked his knuckles. The Decker smirked. Cypher's mind raced. He wasn't just a pawn in their game, he was bait. And he had just unleashed something far worse than they could control. The next day, Neo-Detroit's grid shuddered. Nodes failed. Data spiraled into chaos. And somewhere in the depths of the system, a fragment of Dreamline's legacy stirred, its alien thoughts rippling through the digital void.
Cypher watched the city flicker from the shadows of his hovel, knowing he had become a footnote in the rise of something far beyond human comprehension. The catalyst of becoming. The monolith was first discovered on the arid plains of Atacama, its surface dark as obsidian, its angles sharp as though it had been forged from the void itself. It stood 10 meters high, featureless and inscrutable, reflecting no light despite the harsh desert sun. Satellites had somehow missed it, as had every geological survey of the region. It was simply there one morning, as though it had materialized overnight. Humanity's first encounter with the alien artifact was marked not by fanfare, but by fear. A local shepherd, Diego Morales, stumbled across it while searching for a stray goat. What he saw, or thought he saw, sent him fleeing back to his village, his cries incoherent, but his terror unmistakable. By the time the first researchers arrived, Diego was gone, leaving only his shadow burnt into the rock at the base of the monolith. The monolith calls. Dr. Elena Fisher, lead xenologist of the United Nations Artifact Investigation Team, stood before the alien structure with a mixture of awe and apprehension. It exuded an unnatural presence that made the air feel heavier, as though it were bending the fabric of reality around it. Instruments failed to measure its density, temperature, or material composition. It absorbed radio signals, disrupted magnetic fields, and rendered drones inert as they approached. The shepherd's disappearance had prompted military quarantine of the site. Fisher had argued vehemently against the deployment of weapons near the monolith. It was a message, she believed, a cosmic gift, or perhaps a test. Her first close encounter came with no ceremony. As her gloved hand reached toward the monolith's surface, she hesitated. Its lack of reflection made it seem like a hole in reality, a void that might swallow her if she dared touch it. Yet her scientific curiosity overpowered her fear. The moment her fingers grazed the surface, she was overwhelmed by a torrent of visions. Cities rising and falling, species birthed in fire and extinguished in ice, stars collapsing into blackened singularities, and then, rising from the chaos, humanity, not as it was, but as it could be. Glimmering figures with eyes like galaxies, their forms fluid and unbound by the constraints of flesh. She awoke hours later, trembling on the sand. Her colleagues stood over her, alarmed, but the monolith remained silent, indifferent to the commotion. The acceleration. The effects began subtly. Within weeks, the quarantined researchers reported peculiar dreams, vivid and unsettling, filled with alien geometry and whispers of unimaginable knowledge. Animals in the surrounding area began to behave erratically. A desert fox was observed standing motionless for hours, staring at the monolith, its pupils dilated into black orbs. Days later, it was found dead, its skeletal structure warped beyond recognition. Then came the changes in humans. Dr. Fisher was the first. The incident was recorded by a hidden camera in her private quarters. At precisely 3:15 a.m., she awoke with a scream, clutching her skull. Her body convulsed violently before collapsing to the floor. By morning, she had regained consciousness, but her eyes now shone with an eerie luminescence, and her voice carried a resonance that made the air tremble. Others followed. The phenomenon became known as the shift. Those affected displayed heightened intelligence, telepathic abilities, and a disturbing detachment from their former selves. They began to speak in riddles, referring to humanity as the seed, and the monolith as the root. The shift spread like a virus, defying all attempts at containment. Fishermen in coastal towns began reporting bioluminescent fish, with eyes too large for their sockets. Insects swarmed in synchronized patterns, forming spirals that mirrored the alien symbols etched into the monolith's base. Symbols that had only appeared after Fisher's touch. Fractured Earth. As weeks turned to months, global civilization began to unravel. The shifted formed enclaves, their numbers growing with alarming speed. Governments attempted to suppress them, but conventional weapons failed. The shifted seemed impervious to harm, their bodies adapting to every threat. A chemical agent designed to incapacitate them instead accelerated their transformation. By the time the UN convened an emergency summit, over 1 billion humans had shifted. The monolith's influence had spread across the globe, igniting dormant genes, rewriting the blueprint of life. New species emerged seemingly overnight: birds with translucent wings, serpents that glided on the wind like ribbons of smoke. Humanity was no longer the apex of Earth's evolutionary tree. The shifted did not speak of war, nor did they seem to bear any malice toward the unaltered. They spoke only of becoming. The catalyst speaks. Dr. Fisher, now unrecognizable, became the voice of the shifted. She approached a broadcasting station in Geneva, walking through walls of fire and gunfire alike, untouched. The monolith's influence pulsed in her words, transmitted to billions of screens worldwide. "We are not abandoned," she said, her voice a symphony of tones, some beyond the range of human hearing. "The catalyst has come to elevate us. Do not resist the tide, for it will carry us to shores unknown." The message was met with equal parts awe and terror. In Tokyo, a group of unaltered humans detonated an EMP bomb, attempting to disable what they believed was a signal emanating from the monolith. The resulting explosion killed thousands but left the monolith untouched. The next day, those responsible were found suspended in mid-air outside the city, their bodies frozen in a state of perpetual disintegration, like statues dissolving into dust. The final vision. In the final days, unaltered humans clung to their fragile normalcy, even as the world transformed around them. Forests pulsed with phosphorescent light. Oceans churned with creatures larger than any known to history. The sky itself seemed to shift, constellations rearranging as though the cosmos had turned its gaze upon Earth. Elena Fisher, now the catalyst's emissary, returned to the monolith. Thousands of shifted gathered in silent reverence, forming a spiral around it, their bodies glowing faintly in the twilight. She raised her arms and the monolith began to hum, a deep resonant vibration that shook the earth. In that moment, the unaltered witnessed their final vision, a glimpse of what humanity would become. It was beautiful and horrifying, a species unbound by physical form, existing in a state of perpetual metamorphosis, spanning dimensions incomprehensible to their current understanding. The monolith's purpose became clear. It was not a gift nor a curse, but a catalyst, a spark that ignited the evolutionary flame. Its intentions were unknowable, its origins inscrutable. It simply was, and its work was done. The new dawn. When the monolith vanished, the Earth was no longer recognizable. Humanity, or what remained of it, had transcended into something beyond language, beyond flesh, beyond fear. The catalyst had come and gone, leaving behind a world remade, a world in which becoming was the only constant. For those who remained to witness the first light of the new dawn, it was neither a triumph nor a tragedy. It was simply the next step, and the universe watched in silence.
The hive's grip, the first sign something was wrong, came in the form of screaming, deep, guttural and inhuman. Angela Wren had been mopping the diner's floor when the noise spilled in through the front door. She dropped the mop instinctively, her pulse spiking as she rushed to the window. Outside, the normally quiet street of Pine Hollow was chaos. A man sprinted across the road, flailing wildly, his skin glistening with sweat despite the cold November air. His shirt was torn open, exposing what looked like raised, black-veined welts crawling across his chest. He wasn't running away from something, he was running toward anyone he could find. "Help me!" he shrieked, but his voice was warped, as though layered with an insect-like chittering. His eyes glinted too brightly, unnatural and glassy. Angela stumbled back from the window, her stomach twisting in knots. She fumbled for her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed 911. "We're experiencing high call volumes," the automated voice chirped. The message repeated 3 times before disconnecting. By nightfall, Pine Hollow was unrecognizable. Angela had barricaded herself inside the diner along with 2 other customers, Greg, a burly trucker passing through town, and Marcy, a wiry college student with a knack for biting sarcasm. They watched in silence as infected townsfolk prowled the streets, their bodies twitching unnaturally, heads jerking as if they were listening to some frequency no one else could hear. "What the hell is this?" Greg whispered, gripping his tire iron so tightly his knuckles went white. Drugs? Some kind of mass hysteria? It's not hysteria, Marcy snapped. She pointed out the window where a woman knelt in the middle of the street, her skin rippling as something moved beneath it. That's not normal. That's... What the hell is that? Angela followed Marcy's gaze. The woman was sobbing, clawing at her own flesh. As they watched, dark tendrils emerged from her mouth, writhing like worms tasting the air. Angela gagged, pressing a hand to her mouth. The woman's eyes rolled back and she collapsed, convulsing as the tendrils burrowed back inside her. Moments later, she staggered upright, her body eerily stiff. Her head swiveled toward the diner window and a grotesque grin split her face. "Holy shit, she's seen us!" Greg hissed. The woman's neck cracked loudly as she tilted her head, studying the diner. Then, without warning, she let out a high-pitched screech and charged the glass. The infection wasn't airborne, they learned that quickly enough. "She touched him," Marcy said hours later, her voice shaky. "That's how it spreads." Greg lay on the floor, sweat pooling beneath him as his body writhed. His chest heaved as black veins crept up his arms and neck, a grotesque network that pulsed like it had its own heartbeat. Angela sat against the wall, clutching a shotgun she'd pulled from the diner's storage closet. She didn't know if it would help, but it felt better than nothing. "Stay back," Greg rasped. His voice was already changing, deepening unnaturally. His pupils were dilated, and his eyes darted around the room as if he could see something the others couldn't. "I can hear them. They're calling." "What are you talking about?" Angela demanded, though her voice was barely above a whisper. She didn't want to provoke him, not when he was already gripping the edge of the counter hard enough to splinter the wood. "They're here," Greg croaked, his head jerking toward the ceiling. "They're everywhere." Angela exchanged a glance with Marcy, whose pale face was streaked with tears. They had no way of knowing if Greg could fight off the infection or if he'd end up like the others. But as the hours ticked by, his body convulsed more violently, his veins darkening to a sickly black. By morning, Greg was gone. Not dead. Gone. Angela woke to find the diner's barricade splintered, the door hanging ajar. She couldn't remember falling asleep, but her exhaustion must have overtaken her at some point. Marcy was still slumped against the wall, stirring only when Angela shook her. "What the—" Marcy rubbed her eyes, blinking at the open door. "Where's Greg?" Angela didn't answer. Her heart pounded as she peered outside. The street was eerily quiet, devoid of the infected. The only sign of movement was a faint, twitching shadow disappearing around the corner. "We need to move," Angela said, her voice hoarse. "We can't stay here." The infection spread faster than Angela could have imagined. As she and Marcy made their way through town, they saw the signs everywhere. Blood splattered across car windows, abandoned belongings strewn across sidewalks, and the occasional mutilated body. The infected had changed, their behavior more coordinated. They no longer wandered aimlessly. They moved in groups now, their jerking movements eerily synchronized. "What do they want?" Marcy asked as they crouched behind an overturned car, watching a cluster of infected gather in the center of a park. "They're looking for us," Angela whispered. "They're hunting." The infected weren't mindless, she realized. They were something worse, connected. Whatever was controlling them, it wasn't human. It wasn't long before they were found. The infected descended upon them as they tried to escape through the woods at the edge of town. Angela fired the shotgun until her arms ached, but it was useless. For every one she took down, 2 more appeared, their distorted faces twisted into expressions that were almost mocking. Marcy screamed as one of them lunged, dragging her to the ground. Angela turned to help, but she was too late. Black tendrils spilled from the infected's mouth, writhing toward Marcy's face. Angela didn't wait to see what happened next. She ran, her chest burning, her vision blurred by tears. She reached the highway by nightfall, her legs trembling beneath her. But the world she found there wasn't the one she'd left behind. Cars were abandoned in the middle of the road, their doors flung open as if the drivers had fled in panic. Fires burned in the distance, the acrid smell of smoke mingling with something more putrid. And then she saw them. Thousands of infected, marching in unison along the highway. Their movements were unnaturally smooth now, their twisted forms pulsating with black veins that glowed faintly in the dark. At their head was Greg, or what used to be Greg. His body was grotesquely altered, his limbs elongated, and his face a mask of inhuman glee. He didn't walk. He floated, his feet hovering inches above the ground as the infected followed him like a grotesque parade. Angela crouched behind a rusted truck, her breath hitching. She knew she couldn't outrun them, not now. But as she watched Greg raise a hand, gesturing toward the horizon, she realized something far worse. They weren't staying in Pine Hollow. They were moving outward, spreading. The infection wasn't just a plague, it was an invasion.
And humanity had already lost.
The prism effect. Dr. Caroline Huxley adjusted her helmet, her breath audible within the confines of her suit. The airlock hissed behind her, sealing the 5-member research team inside the alien spacecraft. The vessel, sleek and matte black, had drifted into Earth's orbit a month prior, emitting no signals and appearing abandoned. Its design defied human engineering, seamless curves and angles that seemed to warp perspective. It was beautiful, in a way, yet profoundly unsettling. "Readings indicate breathable air," said Dr. Patel, the team's biologist. His voice clipped through the comms. He glanced at his handheld scanner, frowning at the fluctuating data. "But there's a strange particulate in the atmosphere, nothing I can identify." "Leave the helmets on," Caroline ordered. As the team lead, she felt the weight of every decision like a second layer to her suit. "We stick to protocol." The interior of the spacecraft was equally baffling. The walls were smooth and reflective, yet the reflections didn't align with their movements. Caroline caught glimpses of herself turning corners she hadn't reached yet, or standing still when she was walking. It was as if the ship's surfaces were slightly out of sync with reality. "Are you seeing this?" Dr. Malik, the astrophysicist, asked, his voice tinged with awe and unease. He tapped a finger against the wall, and the reflection rippled like water. "The material, it's responding." Caroline didn't answer. Her focus was on the corridor ahead, which seemed to stretch endlessly before them. Every few steps, the floor shifted beneath their boots, as if adapting to their weight. The sensation was disorienting, and the team's chatter grew quieter the deeper they went. "Look." Dr. Collins, the linguist, pointed at a recessed alcove. Inside was a crystalline structure, suspended mid-air. It emitted a soft, pulsating light, throwing fractured colors onto the walls. The colors moved unnaturally, shifting between hues that defied human vocabulary. Collins approached it, mesmerized. "Collins, don't touch..." Caroline started, but it was too late. His gloved hand brushed the edge of the crystal. The light surged, enveloping the room in a blinding flare. Caroline shielded her eyes, but when the light dimmed, Collins was gone. "Collins?" Malik called, spinning in place. "Where?" The crystalline structure now glowed faintly, a deep, unsettling red. Caroline stepped forward cautiously, scanning the alcove. There was no trace of Collins, no debris, no charred remains. He had simply ceased to exist. "What just happened?" Patel's voice trembled. "Where is he?" Caroline forced herself to stay calm, though her heart thundered in her chest. "We don't know. We need to keep moving, find answers." But the corridor had changed. The path behind them was gone, replaced by another identical stretch. The ship was shifting, corralling them deeper inside. Minutes stretched into hours, or so it felt. Their watches no longer synchronized. Time itself seemed to warp within the spacecraft. They passed more crystalline structures, each glowing faintly in its own unnatural hue. The air grew heavier, and an inexplicable sense of dread settled over the group. "I'm hearing something," Malik said, pausing mid-step. His head tilted as if straining to catch a faint sound. Caroline stopped and listened. At first, There was only silence, but then she heard it too, a low, droning hum, punctuated by faint whispers. It was like 1,000 voices murmuring just out of comprehension. "It's coming from there," Patel said, pointing to a door ahead. Unlike the rest of the smooth surfaces, the door was angular and solid, etched with intricate symbols. It slid open as they approached, revealing a cavernous chamber. Inside, suspended in midair, was a massive, multifaceted crystal. Its surface shimmered, reflecting images that were horribly familiar. Caroline saw herself as a child, crying alone in her room. Malik saw his mother's funeral. Patel's breath hitched as he glimpsed himself struggling in an overflowing river. "It's showing us our fears," Patel whispered, stepping back. "No," Malik said, his voice shaking. "It's not just showing them, it's amplifying them." The whispers grew louder, morphing into a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from within their own minds. Caroline felt her knees weaken as her surroundings shifted. She was back in her childhood bedroom, the air thick with the scent of mildew and fear. Her reflection in the mirror grinned at her, though she wasn't smiling. "It's not real," she muttered, clutching her helmet like a lifeline. "It's the ship. It's doing this to us." Her comm crackled. "Caroline," Malik's voice came through, strained and barely audible. "Get out of there." She forced herself to look away from the mirror. The room dissolved around her, and she was back in the chamber, the crystal pulsating angrily. Malik and Patel stood frozen, their faces pale. They were all trapped in their own horrors. "Focus," Caroline barked, her voice cutting through the chaos. "It's feeding on us. We have to shut it down." "How?" Patel asked, his voice laced with panic. "We don't even know what it is." Caroline looked at the crystal, its surface rippling with their collective fears. "The particulate," she said suddenly, remembering Patel's earlier observation. "It's in the air. It's in us. It's making us hallucinate." She reached for the oxygen regulator on her suit, twisting it to maximum flow. The clean air flooded her lungs, and the oppressive weight of the hallucinations lifted slightly. "Switch to pure oxygen," she commanded. Patel and Malik scrambled to comply. As they did, the whispers subsided and the crystal dimmed. The ship seemed to shudder in response, as if aware of their resistance. The door behind them slammed shut, and the walls began to close in. "Move!" Caroline shouted. They sprinted toward the far side of the chamber, where another door flickered into view. As they ran, the floor tilted beneath them, and the crystal surged with renewed energy. Caroline could feel its pull, like invisible hands clawing at her mind, trying to drag her back into her worst memories. But she kept moving, refusing to look back. They reached the door just as the walls converged. It slid open, revealing an airlock. Caroline shoved Patel and Malik through, slamming the emergency release. The door sealed, cutting off the crystal's glow. For a moment there was silence. Then the ship rumbled, and the airlock began to decompress. "We're being ejected," Malik said, panic rising in his voice. Caroline didn't hesitate. She grabbed the emergency beacon from her belt and activated it, praying the retrieval ship was still in range. The airlock door blasted open, and they were hurled into the void of space. Hours later, Caroline awoke in the medbay of their research vessel. Malik and Patel were already conscious, their faces drawn and pale. She sat up, wincing at the ache in her muscles. "What happened to the ship?" she asked. "The moment we were ejected," Patel said. "It vanished. Just disappeared." Caroline stared at him, her mind racing. "It wasn't a ship," she said finally. "It was a trap, a living organism designed to lure and feed on intelligent life." Malik nodded grimly. "And we were its prey."
Caroline leaned back, her hands trembling. The beacon had saved them, but the knowledge of what they'd encountered would haunt her forever. Somewhere out there, the ship, or whatever it was, still drifted, waiting for its next victims. the shape of silence. The door is small, impossibly so. I crouch, pressing one eye against the crack, and what I see is not what I expected. A staircase spiraling down, its edges shimmering like heat waves. The air smells like wet stone and copper. My breath clouds the keyhole's surface, erasing what little I can see. From the Sonder study, collected notes of Dr. Elias Brandt. Entry 1, a house like no other. When the house first appeared on Longmeadow Drive, it was as unassuming as its neighbours. A squat, pale structure with peeling paint, it barely looked large enough for a single occupant. Yet the for sale sign posted out front boasted an unusual detail. Boundless interior, a rare find. Yeah, but I wouldn't have noticed it at all if not for Dr. Elias Brandt, a fringe academic who had gone missing 2 years prior. His name surfaced in connection with the property after his notes were leaked to an obscure online forum. Among these fragments were crude diagrams, unsettling sketches, and annotations that referenced non-Euclidean corridors, temporal distortions, and a room that breathes. Curiosity, or perhaps obsession, drove me to the front porch. The door creaked under my hand. What lay beyond changed everything. Entry 2. The geometry of disquiet. Inside, the foyer is deceptively normal. Polished hardwood floors reflect the faint glow of a dusty chandelier. Yet, within moments, it becomes clear that space does not obey familiar rules. A hallway to the right appears to stretch infinitely. No matter how far I walk, the end remains out of reach. Retracing my steps, I find the front door, but it is not the same. The frame is subtly distorted, tilting at an angle that forces me to stoop to exit. When I step outside, I am not on Longmeadow Drive. I find myself in a cavernous room. Its walls ripple like water, and faint whispers, if they can be called that, echo faintly. My voice does not return when I call out. I run back through the door, but the foyer is gone. Entry 3. Multimedia fragments. Among Dr. Brandt's leaked files is a grainy VHS recording labelled Sub-Level 3, EO123. The tape begins with the distorted hum of static, then cuts to a dimly lit corridor. The frame shudders as the cameraman, presumably Brandt, moves forward. Walls undulate like living tissue. Overlapping voices mutter just out of reach, though their words are unintelligible. At 0114, the camera swings violently toward a breach in the wall, a jagged triangular opening. Something moves within the shadows. Brandt whispers, "It sees us." The recording ends abruptly. Entry 4. The staircase that moves. I encounter the spiral staircase on my 3rd day in the house, or perhaps my 5th. Time, like distance, feels unreliable here. The stairs descend into a void, their edges flickering as if resisting observation. The closer I get, the colder the air becomes. My flashlight beam fades long before it should. Somewhere below, there is a faint but constant noise. A wet, rhythmic slapping. I hesitate before descending. Behind me, the door I entered from is gone. Footnote: Architectural anomalies. The house exhibits clear violations of spatial continuity. Walls curve subtly, creating an illusion of depth far greater than their exterior should allow. Attempts to measure distances are futile. Tape measures fray, and laser tools return corrupted data. E. Brandt Personal Observations, Volume 2. Entry 5. The rooms that hunger. Some rooms are mundane, dusty libraries, kitchens filled with rotting food, parlours empty but for shattered mirrors. Others defy comprehension. One chamber, circular and vast, has no visible ceiling. Instead, an expanse of stars glitters overhead, though I am certain I remain indoors. In another, the walls are lined with rows of small holes, each of which emits a faint, almost imperceptible breathing. I discover an object lying on the floor, a notebook, its cover marred by deep gouges. Inside are frantic scrawls. Do not close your eyes, the house is patient. Entry 6. Interruption. At this point in the narrative, several pages are missing. Handwritten annotations in the margins suggest the editor removed them due to excessive irrelevance. The abrupt shift in tone and format that follows is disconcerting. Entry 7, a witness account, recorded by former tenant Amanda Crowley in an audio file titled Longmeadow Log 03 Wave. It doesn't let you leave. I tried, God knows I tried. But the house changes when you turn your back. The room I slept in? It had 2 windows yesterday. This morning, there's a single, narrow slit, barely wide enough to let in light. At night it grows worse. Walls pulse, door frames swell and shrink. And the thing in the basement? Don't. Go. Down. The recording ends with a sharp, metallic scraping, followed by Crowley's panicked breathing. Entry 8. The thing beneath. The staircase ends abruptly in an enormous cavernous hall. My flashlight reveals walls slick with moisture, veined like living tissue. In the centre lies an immense undulating mass. It heaves as if breathing. Its surface gleams, organic yet metallic, its form impossible to fully grasp. Eyes, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, open across its surface, each focusing on me. A voice, not my own, fills the space. It speaks without sound, directly into my thoughts. You are lost because I allow it, you remain because I desire it. I run, though I do not remember my feet moving. The house reconfigures itself to guide me back to its maw. It hungers. Entry 9. Fragmentary escape. Editor's note: the following section is heavily redacted. I reached the door, the real one. The street beyond was gone, replaced by... Its voice was in my mind, it grows louder, even now. Entry 10, conclusion. The house remains vacant on Longmeadow Drive. The for sale sign still stands, though no one dares approach it. At night, lights flicker within, though the electricity was disconnected years ago. Locals speak of screams heard at odd hours, muffled and distorted as if filtered through static. Dr. Elias Brandt's notes, which once filled entire servers, have mysteriously vanished. Those who read them, myself included, dream of infinite hallways and breathing walls.
The house waits. It always waits.
The Enigma of Solis 7. When the object designated Solis 7 entered the solar system, its trajectory defied explanation. Travelling at half the speed of light, it slowed upon approach to the inner planets, as if guided by an intelligence beyond human comprehension. It was vast, larger than Earth's tallest mountains and shaped like a perfect spindle, smooth, metallic, and featureless, save for the faint iridescent sheen that seemed to ripple across its surface like sunlight on water. The United Nations Space Exploration Consortium, UNSEC, dispatched the Vanguard, humanity's most advanced exploratory vessel, to intercept. Led by Commander Ilara Thorne, the team consisted of a mix of scientists, engineers, and security personnel, all seasoned in deep space missions. Their goal: enter Solis 7, analyze its structure, and uncover its purpose. Entry. The Vanguard approached cautiously. Despite the ship's monolithic exterior, sensors detected a thin, atmospheric layer clinging to its surface. A curious feature, though it paled in comparison to the discovery of a massive aperture, perfectly circular opening as the Vanguard neared. It was an invitation, one the crew couldn't ignore. The team disembarked in suits equipped with modular life support systems, armed not only with scientific instruments but also weapons. Humanity had learned, through bitter experience, to anticipate the unexpected. Inside, they found a cavernous chamber stretching miles into darkness. The walls shimmered, a faint phosphorescence providing just enough light to navigate. There was no sign of traditional machinery, no pipes, no wires, no visible means of propulsion. Instead, the surface undulated slightly, as though the ship itself were alive. Organic material, murmured Dr. Aaron Patel, the team's biologist, running a handheld scanner along the wall. It's not metallic at all. Commander Thorne frowned. You're saying the ship is alive? Alive might be a stretch, but it's biologically active. A faint hum resonated through the chamber, subtle but omnipresent. It set the crew's teeth on edge. As they ventured deeper, the hum intensified, seeming to sync with their heartbeats. The living world. The true nature of Solace 7 revealed itself as they moved farther in. The sterile, metallic outer chamber gave way to something extraordinary. A vast, self-contained ecosystem. Towering structures that resembled trees reached toward a distant ceiling, their branches glowing faintly. Streams of translucent liquid coursed through the floor, their flow erratic, almost as though they pulsed with purpose. "Good God," whispered Lieutenant Evan Moss, the team's geologist. "It's a biosphere." Patel's scanner beeped furiously. "It's not just a biosphere, it's self-sustaining. Oxygen levels are rising as we move. Photosynthesis analogues, nutrient cycles. This is a closed system. It could support life indefinitely." Commander Thorne nodded, her voice calm despite the awe in her eyes. "Stay sharp. Ecosystems aren't always benign." Her caution proved prescient. As the team advanced, they encountered creatures, floating, jellyfish-like entities that hovered in the air, trailing tendrils. They seemed harmless at first, but when one drifted too close to an exposed power cable from the team's equipment, it released an arc of electricity that melted the wiring instantly. "Defensive mechanism," said Patel, his voice tight. "They're territorial." Thorne ordered the team to stay close, their weapons drawn. The first loss. Hours later, the team discovered a massive clearing dominated by a single structure, a dome-like formation that pulsed with a dull light. Strange symbols adorned its surface, carved with meticulous precision. Dr. Lena Volkov, the team's linguist, approached with cautious curiosity. This looks like a written language." Before she could study it further, a low growl echoed through the clearing. From the underbrush emerged a creature unlike anything they had ever seen, quadrupedal, with iridescent chitinous plating and eyes that glowed an unnatural green. It moved with alarming speed, its claws slicing through the air with a metallic shriek. The team opened fire. The creature recoiled but didn't fall. Only a precise shot from Moss's plasma rifle stopped it, the beast collapsing into a heap with a final guttural hiss. The relief was short-lived. The creature's body dissolved into a viscous black liquid, which seeped into the ground and disappeared. Moments later, the hum that had followed them since entry grew louder, deeper, and more menacing. The biosphere itself seemed to react as though the death of the creature had triggered an immune response. "Move!" barked Thorne. "Now!" As they retreated, Volkov stumbled. Something lashed out from the ground, a whip-like tendril that coiled around her ankle and dragged her screaming into the underbrush. The others fired blindly into the vegetation, but it was too late. When they finally reached her, all that remained was her shredded suit and the faint smear of blood on the alien soil. The core. With heavy hearts, the remaining team pressed on. They followed a winding path through the biosphere, navigating terrain that grew increasingly hostile. The air thickened, tinged with an acrid, metallic taste. The glowing trees dimmed, their light replaced by a bioluminescent fungus that spread across the ground in pulsating patterns. They finally reached the core, a chamber vast enough to dwarf the grandest cathedral. At its center stood an enormous, crystalline structure, glowing with an inner light. Tendrils extended from its base, connecting it to the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was alive, pulsating in rhythm with the now deafening hum. "It's the heart of the ship," said Patel, awe in his voice. "It's not just a vessel, it's a living entity. The ecosystem, the creatures, they're part of it." Thorne approached cautiously, her weapon lowered but ready. "Why did it come here? What does it want?" Patel shook his head. "If it's sentient, it may have no concept of us. We could be microbes in its eyes, or threats." As they debated, the crystalline structure began to shift. Patterns formed within its surface, geometric shapes that rearranged in an unsettlingly deliberate manner. A beam of light shot out, enveloping the team in a blinding glow. The revelation. The light subsided, leaving the team disoriented. In its place, images flooded their minds, alien vistas, towering spires, creatures both wondrous and horrifying. And then, a final image. Earth, seen from space, wreathed in clouds. "It's studying us," murmured Moss. "It's trying to understand." Patel's face was pale. "Or it's deciding what to do with us." The crystalline structure pulsed again, faster now, the patterns within its surface spiraling toward chaos. The hum grew unbearable, vibrating through their bones. The team's equipment malfunctioned, screens flashing static before going dark. "Fall back!" shouted Thorn. But as they turned to flee, the chamber sealed itself. Tendrils erupted from the walls, cutting off their escape. The biosphere itself seemed to close in, the once lush environment transforming into a nightmarish labyrinth of thorns and predatory creatures. The price. One by one, the team fell. Moss was taken by a swarm of airborne predators. Patel sacrificed himself to hold off a massive insect-like creature, buying Thorn precious seconds to escape. Alone, battered, and weaponless, she reached the chamber's edge. The crystalline structure loomed before her, its light now pulsating erratically. Thorn, desperation etched on her face, activated a small device on her wrist, a nuclear failsafe, designed as a last resort. "If you're listening," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "know that we only wanted to understand." As the timer ticked down, the crystalline structure emitted one final image into her mind, an unmistakable gesture of regret. The detonation obliterated the chamber, sending shockwaves through Solis 7. From a distance, the Vanguard recorded the ship's sudden collapse, its once imposing form crumpling into itself before disappearing in a blinding flash of light. Aftermath. Earth's authorities declared the mission a failure, the loss of the Vanguard and its crew a tragedy. Yet strange phenomena followed. Radio transmissions filled with unfamiliar patterns, ecosystems on Earth exhibiting unexplained growth.
Solis 7 was gone, but its legacy lingered. Somewhere, deep in the fabric of space, the enigma endured, waiting for the next explorers bold, or foolish, enough to seek it out. The spheres beyond midnight. In the waning hours of a pale autumn night, Alaric Thorn found himself stirred from slumber by a call he could not name, yet could not resist. The scent of strange blossoms and the low hum of distant, otherworldly chants had seeped into his dreams for weeks, carrying him to a realm not of Earth, nor wholly of the stars. Tonight, the portal revealed itself fully, a rift in the fabric of his unconscious, a yawning spiral of lightless hues and inverted geometries. The journey began with a single step, for Thorn's will had been sundered by curiosity. As he moved through the rift, the very laws of space seemed to recoil. He was no longer in his modest chamber, surrounded by the familiar artifacts of mundane life, but within a realm sprawling with alien grandeur, where cyclopean monoliths and roiling clouds of amethyst fog pierced a sky devoid of stars. It was a place that breathed, a dreamscape alive with whispers of half-formed gods and forgotten things that stirred in the corners of consciousness. The air carried an oppressive weight, and yet Thorn found himself drawn ever deeper, his mind a captive to sights that mortal eyes should never behold. The wailing expanse. The first domain he traversed was a wasteland of cracked obsidian plains, from which emanated an endless wailing that was neither wind nor voice, but some amalgamation of both. The sound gnawed at his reason, forcing him to clutch his ears as he stumbled forward. Great fissures yawned in the ground, and from their depths rose a phosphorescent mist that coiled and writhed like serpents. It was there that he encountered the Watchers, elongated figures of translucent jade, whose faces were faceless, yet conveyed an undeniable malice. They stood sentinel over the fissures, their arms outstretched as if to summon or restrain the horrors below. When Thorn drew too near, their heads twisted toward him in a synchronized, unnatural motion, and a soundless scream erupted in his mind. Fleeing their gaze, he ran until the wails of the expanse were drowned by silence. The city of waking ruins. Emerging from the wasteland, Thorn found himself at the threshold of an ancient city, its architecture an affront to geometry and comprehension. Towers spiraled upward at impossible angles, adorned with runes that shifted and writhed like living things. The streets were paved with metallic tiles that shimmered in colors he could not name, and every corner seemed to bend toward some central, unseen force. The city was not empty. Lithe, amorphous beings with glistening, opalescent skins moved through the labyrinth, their gait fluid, yet unnervingly deliberate. They paid Thorn no heed, their attentions fixed on the towering spires from which faint rhythmic vibrations emanated. The air buzzed with an eldritch frequency that seeped into Thorn's bones, filling him with a sense of impending revelation, or annihilation. In the heart of the city stood a dais of black stone, upon which sat a figure cloaked in robes that shimmered like liquid night. Its presence radiated an aura of authority and dread, and though its face was obscured, Thorn felt its gaze pierce his very soul. The figure raised a skeletal hand and spoke in a language that was not sound, but thought, planting visions in Thorn's mind. Visions of realms beyond comprehension, of cyclopean entities slumbering in dimensions removed from time. "You are but a ripple in the current," the figure intoned, "but ripples may awaken the stagnant. Beware what you stir, traveler." The labyrinth of living stone. The figure's words drove Thorn onward, for their meaning was both a warning and a summons. Beyond the city lay a labyrinth carved into the living flesh of the dream realm itself. The walls pulsed and shuddered, their surfaces veined with ichor that glowed faintly in the dim light of a bioluminescent sky. The air here was heavy with a sickly sweet aroma, and the sound of a beating heart echoed faintly through the twisting corridors. As Thorn navigated the maze, he felt the labyrinth shifting around him, as if it were alive and aware of his presence. Walls moved, corridors closed, and the paths he thought he knew led only deeper into the living depths. It was here that the first of the horrors revealed itself, a writhing, many-eyed monstrosity that slithered through the passages with a sound like tearing fabric. Its gaze burned into Thorn, filling him with an otherworldly dread that threatened to shatter his mind. But Thorn had no choice but to press on. He evaded the beast by plunging into a narrow crevice, the walls of which oozed a viscous fluid that hissed against his skin. Emerging on the other side, he found himself in a vast chamber dominated by a titanic, pulsating organ. A heart, perhaps, or something far worse. The organ throbbed with an ancient primordial rhythm, and from its surface sprouted tendrils that writhed and reached as if seeking to ensnare. In that moment, Thorn understood the labyrinth's purpose. It was not merely a passage, but a lure, drawing dreamers toward this obscene core. With a desperate cry, he fled, vowing to escape the labyrinth's grasp. The shattered firmament. Thorn's journey reached its climax in a domain that defied all reason, a void of fragmented light and swirling chaos where the very fabric of reality seemed to unravel. Here, he floated weightlessly, adrift in a sea of fractured time and space. Enormous spheres of crackling energy drifted through the void, their surfaces marked with runes that pulsed with an inscrutable power. It was here that he encountered the entity known only as the Keeper of Spheres, a being of immense, shifting form, whose presence filled the void with a resonant hum. Its many limbs stretched and coiled, each tipped with a glimmering eye that regarded Thorn with a cold, detached curiosity. "You tread the paths of the unformed," the Keeper spoke, its voice a choir of dissonant tones. "Few reach this far, and fewer still return. Tell me, wanderer, what is it you seek?" Thorn could not answer, for his journey had never been one of purpose, but of compulsion. The Keeper seemed to sense this, and with a gesture, it summoned a sphere of pulsating light that hovered before him. "Take this shard of knowing, but beware the price. To see is to bear the weight of sight, Thorn reached out, his hand trembling as it closed around the sphere. In that instant, his mind was flooded with visions of cosmic truths, of realms and entities beyond comprehension, of the fragile insignificance of humanity in the grand scheme of existence. He screamed as the knowledge threatened to consume him, and the Keeper's laughter echoed in the void. Awakening. When Thorn awoke, he was back in his chamber, the pale light of dawn filtering through the window. Yet the dream had left its mark. His mind was forever scarred by the truths he had glimpsed, and his body bore strange iridescent markings that pulsed faintly beneath his skin.
The world seemed smaller now, its certainties fragile and hollow. He knew that the dream realm would call to him again, and that the entities he had encountered would wait, their unknowable purposes entwined with his fate. And as he stared into the growing light of day, he felt a deep, gnawing dread, for the spheres beyond midnight had left their mark, and his soul would never again be his own.
Thank you for watching, and remember, the darkness awaits. Until our paths cross again, stay fearful and stay subscribed.